"Go ahead and tow it," the man said quietly. "Just make sure every name and timestamp on that order can survive the questions that come afterward." By the time Officer Ronald Sullivan heard those words, the tow truck was already less than a block away, and nearly everyone watching assumed they were about to witness another routine parking dispute. Nobody standing on that sidewalk could have guessed the morning would become something far more complicated than a simple citation. It was just after 8:30 on a cool Monday morning in downtown Richmond, Virginia. Office workers carrying coffee hurried toward glass-fronted buildings, while city buses rolled through steady traffic and delivery vans competed for curb space along Broad Street. Across from City Hall stood the Regional Transportation Coordination Center, a government office that rarely attracted public attention despite handling countless transportation projects that affected millions of drivers every year. Like most weekdays, the loading zone in front of the building remained busy with maintenance vehicles, couriers, and contractors dropping off time-sensitive documents before moving along within a few minutes. Officer Ronald Sullivan had been assigned to traffic enforcement in the district for almost 6 years. Tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a sharply pressed uniform, Sullivan carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed rules worked only when enforced immediately. His crew cut was always perfectly trimmed, his boots polished before every shift, and his reputation around the department was simple. He never tolerated excuses. Some co-workers admired his discipline. Others quietly thought he escalated situations that could have ended with ordinary conversations. Sullivan ignored those opinions. As far as he was concerned, consistency mattered more than popularity. That morning his attention settled on a black Chevrolet Tahoe that had stopped in the loading zone. The engine remained running while its driver stepped out carrying nothing more than a slim leather portfolio. Sullivan glanced toward the nearby sign. Commercial loading only. 15-minute limit. No unattended parking. Without hesitation, he started walking toward the SUV while activating the body camera clipped to his uniform. The driver, Ricky Salazar, had already entered the transportation building before Sullivan reached the vehicle. Ricky was in his late 30s, athletic, neatly dressed in dark jeans, work boots, and a light gray button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled once above his wrists. His neatly combed-over hair was clean and professional, but nothing about his appearance suggested high-ranking government authority. If anything, he looked like an experienced project manager or engineering consultant arriving for another ordinary workday. Inside the building, Ricky greeted the receptionist by name before signing the visitor log. He explained that he was there to collect a sealed inspection binder prepared over the weekend for a regional infrastructure review beginning later that morning. The receptionist apologized for the slight delay, explaining that another employee was retrieving the file from a secured records room upstairs. Ricky smiled politely and thanked her. He glanced toward the large lobby clock. Barely 2 minutes had passed since he parked outside. Back on the sidewalk, Sullivan had already begun entering information into his handheld citation device. Only minutes earlier, Sullivan had watched a white delivery driver leave a van unattended at the same curb while carrying 2 boxes through a neighboring doorway. The driver returned several minutes later, and Sullivan allowed him to leave with nothing more than a warning. Now, when a nearby courier loading medical supplies pointed toward Ricky's Tahoe and cautiously mentioned that its driver had only stepped inside for a moment, Sullivan barely acknowledged him. "Rules don't pause because somebody thinks they'll be quick," he replied without looking up. Another pedestrian slowed to watch. Then another. The sight of a police officer writing tickets almost always attracted attention, especially during the morning rush when dozens of people were walking between office buildings. Sullivan circled the Tahoe, recording photographs from multiple angles before speaking into his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. Requesting discretionary contracted tow authorization for a vehicle unattended in a restricted municipal loading zone. I will complete the required tow eligibility verification now." The dispatcher confirmed the request and began contacting the city's towing contractor. Minutes later, Ricky walked back through the lobby doors carrying the thick black binder tucked securely beneath one arm. The first thing he noticed was the small crowd gathering near his SUV. The second was Officer Sullivan placing a bright orange citation beneath the windshield wiper. Ricky crossed to the Tahoe, switched off the engine, removed the keys, and closed the driver's door before taking a slow breath and turning toward the officer. "Good morning, officer," he said evenly. Is there a problem? Sullivan turned toward him with practiced confidence. The problem is you left your vehicle unattended in a restricted loading zone. It's already being processed for towing. Ricky looked briefly at the sign, then back at Sullivan. I was inside for less than 3 minutes picking up scheduled government documents. Doesn't matter, Sullivan answered. The vehicle was unattended. Ricky nodded once instead of arguing. Would you mind if I explain why I was here? Sullivan folded his arms. You can explain it to the hearing officer after you pay the citation. Several people nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. Ricky remained calm. He neither raised his voice nor protested. He simply rested the inspection binder against his leg and studied the officer for a brief moment, as though deciding what mattered most in the conversation. Then, without another word, he unlocked the driver's door and carefully removed a slim black leather credential case that had remained tucked inside the center console. Ricky opened the slim black leather credential case slowly enough that every movement could be seen on Officer Ronald Sullivan's body camera. He did not thrust it forward or demand that anyone read it. Instead, he held it at chest level and said, I would appreciate it if you would review this before the tow truck arrives. Sullivan barely glanced toward the case before shaking his head. Keep it. Identification does not change the parking violation. Ricky remained composed. I understand that. I am only asking you to verify who you are dealing with before making your final decision. Sullivan answered with a short laugh that several people nearby clearly heard. Everybody suddenly becomes important after they get caught. A woman waiting for a city bus quietly looked away, uncomfortable with the tone of the exchange. The courier who had spoken earlier finished unloading his packages but stayed close enough to watch. Ricky closed the credential case without showing any frustration. Very well, he replied. May I at least explain why the vehicle was stopped here? Sullivan checked the screen on his handheld device while speaking. You already had your chance. The citation has been entered, and the tow request has been submitted. Ricky nodded once. Then I have one more question. Sullivan looked up. What is it? Before the vehicle is removed, have all required verification steps been completed according to your department's towing procedures? Sullivan frowned. The question sounded unusually specific. Still, he answered without hesitation. I know my procedures. Ricky gave a polite smile that revealed nothing. I hope so. The words lingered in the air just long enough for several bystanders to exchange curious looks. Even the courier raised an eyebrow. Sullivan immediately interpreted the remark as another attempt to delay enforcement. He pressed the transmit button on his shoulder radio. Dispatch, confirm contracted tow is still responding. The dispatcher answered that the truck was only a few minutes away. Sullivan acknowledged the update and returned his attention to Ricky. If you interfere with the tow process, additional citations may apply. Ricky calmly shook his head. I have no intention of interfering. Instead, he stepped back from the SUV, keeping both hands visible and allowing Sullivan complete access to the vehicle. His calm reaction seemed almost unexpected. Most drivers argued. Some pleaded. Others became visibly angry. Ricky did none of those things. He simply stood beside the Tahoe with the black binder tucked beneath one arm and the credential case resting loosely in his hand. The unusual silence made the growing crowd even more attentive. At that moment, the low rumble of a diesel engine echoed from around the corner. Several people turned their heads as the city's contracted tow truck entered Broad Street and slowly approached the loading zone with its amber warning lights flashing. Sullivan appeared satisfied. To him, the situation was nearly finished. Ricky watched the truck arrive with the same calm expression he had maintained from the beginning. As the driver positioned the truck behind the Tahoe, Ricky quietly removed his phone from his pocket. He did not call for legal help. He did not record the officer. He simply placed a brief call after checking the time on his watch. Good morning, he said in an even voice when someone answered. I have arrived at the location. There has been an unexpected delay, but I am already here. He listened for only a few seconds before replying. Understood. Thank you. Then he ended the call and returned the telephone to his pocket. Sullivan noticed the conversation and smirked. Calling somebody to make this disappear? Ricky answered honestly. No. I was only letting my office know that I would be running behind schedule. Sullivan dismissed the explanation with a shrug. Behind him, the tow truck operator climbed out of the cab carrying his inspection clipboard. He He took several steps toward the Tahoe before lifting his eyes toward the driver standing beside it. The moment their eyes met, his confident stride stopped completely. A look of immediate recognition crossed his face, and for several long seconds, he said absolutely nothing. The tow truck operator stood motionless for several seconds before lowering the clipboard to his side. His expression shifted from routine concentration to genuine surprise. Then he gave Ricky a small, respectful nod. "Good morning, Mr. Salazar," he said. "I did not expect to see you here today." Ricky returned the greeting with the same calm tone he had used throughout the morning. "Neither did I, Sergio." Officer Ronald Sullivan immediately looked from one man to the other. "You know each other?" Sergio nodded. "We have met several times during transportation compliance reviews." Sullivan folded his arms. "That has nothing to do with this tow." Sergio hesitated before answering. "No, sir. I understand." Ricky spoke before the conversation could become uncomfortable. "Go ahead and tow it," Ricky said quietly. "Just make sure every name and timestamp on that order can survive the questions that come afterward. I do not want anyone placed in a difficult position because of me." Sergio looked uncertain. "Mr. Salazar, are you absolutely certain?" Ricky smiled politely. "Completely." The answer caught Sullivan off guard. He had expected another attempt to delay the process. Instead, Ricky appeared willing to let everything proceed exactly as instructed. Sullivan interpreted the calm confidence as arrogance. "You heard him," Sullivan said. "Prepare the vehicle." Sergio slowly walked toward the rear of the Tahoe, but his movements lacked the certainty he had shown only moments earlier. Before attaching any towing equipment to the Tahoe, he completed his own required inspection, carefully documenting the condition of the vehicle with photographs. Several people watching noticed that he was taking considerably more time than most towing crews usually spent on ordinary parking violations. Ricky remained exactly where he was, saying nothing. The only sound came from passing traffic and the occasional click of Sergio's camera. While Sullivan watched the inspection, an older city maintenance supervisor exited the transportation building carrying a toolbox. He paused after recognizing Ricky. "Morning, Ricky," he called. "Are you still here? I thought your meeting started at 9. Ricky answered with a friendly smile. "It does. We have had a small delay." The supervisor looked toward the tow truck, then toward Officer Sullivan, but chose not to ask additional questions before continuing across the street. Sullivan noticed the exchange, but dismissed it. To him, it simply meant Ricky worked with city employees from time to time. It changed nothing about the violation. A minute later, Ricky quietly checked the time again before removing his telephone for a second time. He stepped several feet away from the growing crowd so he would not interrupt anyone. His voice remained low and professional. "This is Ricky Salazar. I am confirming that I am still at the original location. There is no need to change today's schedule. Please proceed exactly as planned." He listened carefully before replying. "Yes. Everything is developing naturally." After ending the call, he returned to the sidewalk without offering any explanation. Sullivan watched him closely. The phrase echoed in his mind. Developing naturally. It sounded less like someone dealing with an unexpected parking citation and more like someone calmly observing events unfold according to expectations. For the first time that morning, Sullivan felt a brief moment of uncertainty, but it disappeared almost as quickly as it came. He reminded himself that rules were rules. Credentials, conversations, and familiar faces could not erase a parking violation. Meanwhile, traffic continued flowing through downtown, and another dark gray sport utility vehicle quietly turned onto Broad Street before parking legally across from the transportation building. Two professionally dressed men stepped out carrying identical black document cases. They did not approach the scene immediately. Instead, they remained on the opposite sidewalk, speaking briefly with one another while occasionally glancing toward Ricky, Officer Sullivan, and the waiting tow truck. None of the bystanders recognized them. Sullivan never noticed them at all. Ricky did, but his expression never changed. He simply adjusted the inspection binder beneath his arm and waited patiently as the two men finished crossing the street together. The two men crossed the street at an unhurried pace, each carrying a black document case instead of a briefcase or laptop bag. Their business attire blended naturally with the morning crowd, and neither wore anything that immediately identified where they worked. They stopped several feet from Ricky before one of them offered a polite handshake. "Good morning, Ricky. We apologize for the delay." Ricky returned the handshake. No apology necessary. We are still on schedule. Officer Ronald Sullivan stepped forward before the conversation could continue. Gentlemen, this area is part of an active enforcement action. If you are here for this driver, you will need to wait. The older of the two visitors smiled courteously. That will not be a problem, officer. His calm response only reinforced Sullivan's confidence that the situation remained completely under control. Ricky finally reopened the slim black credential case he had been holding since the beginning of the encounter. This time he extended it towards Sullivan without saying a word. Perhaps because additional witnesses had gathered, or perhaps because the presence of the two visitors changed the atmosphere, Sullivan accepted it. He examined the identification card for several seconds. The name matched the driver's license. Ricky Salazar. Below it appeared another credential bearing the seal of the United States Department of Transportation. Sullivan read the title once, then again more carefully. Federal Highway Administration, Office of Civil Rights, Transportation Compliance Review Team. His expression changed only slightly. He handed the credential back. That explains where you work, he said. It does not exempt you from parking regulations. Ricky slipped the credential into its case. I never suggested that it did. Sullivan looked surprised by the answer. He had expected an argument based on authority. Instead, Ricky appeared to agree with him completely. Then I do not understand why everyone seems so concerned, Sullivan replied. Ricky answered with the same steady voice that had never once risen during their conversation. Because today's issue is not whether a citation may be justified. That question can be resolved through the normal process. My concern is why discretionary towing was initiated almost immediately, whether the required verification occurred first, and whether drivers in comparable circumstances have been treated consistently. Sullivan narrowed his eyes. My department does not answer to your office. Not directly, Ricky replied. Our office conducts those reviews. My assignment this morning was simply to collect inspection materials that had already been prepared for a review scheduled to begin later today. That review examines whether transportation programs receiving federal support are administered consistently and without racial discrimination, including municipal towing practices connected to those programs, the documentation used to justify discretionary decisions, and the civil rights safeguards adopted by participating agencies. The younger visitor quietly opened his document case and removed a thin folder without interrupting. Several bystanders watched the exchange with growing curiosity. The tow truck operator remained beside his truck, waiting patiently for further instructions, but making no effort to attach the vehicle. Even he seemed to sense that the situation had become something far different from an ordinary parking tow. Sullivan crossed his arms again. You are still not stopping this tow. Ricky gave a slight nod. That decision belongs to you. There was no challenge in his voice. No threat. Only a simple acknowledgement that the officer retained authority over the immediate enforcement decision. The unexpected answer seemed to unsettle Sullivan more than open disagreement would have. The older visitor finally spoke. Officer Sullivan, may we ask one procedural question? Sullivan looked at him cautiously. Go ahead. Would you please provide the towing authorization record associated with this vehicle, including the time the request was initiated? Sullivan frowned. Why would you need that? The visitor answered without changing his calm expression. Because the sequence of documentation is sometimes just as important as the documentation itself. Sullivan reached for his handheld device, convinced the records would fully support every action he had taken that morning. As he unlocked the screen and began opening the enforcement log, neither visitor spoke another word. They simply waited while Ricky quietly looked toward the display, and after several silent seconds, the older visitor asked one additional question that caused even the tow truck operator to look up. Officer, would you also include the original dispatch timestamp before any later updates are displayed? Officer Ronald Sullivan unlocked the enforcement record and turned the screen so the older visitor could see it without taking the device from his hands. The visitor never attempted to touch the equipment. He simply read each line carefully while the younger colleague quietly compared the information with a printed checklist from his folder. Ricky remained silent. He stood beside his Tahoe with the inspection binder tucked beneath one arm, allowing the review to unfold naturally. After nearly a minute, the older visitor asked, Officer, would you mind scrolling back to the first entry? Sullivan complied, still convinced everything had been handled correctly. The visitor studied the timestamps one by one. Citation initiated. Vehicle photographs uploaded. Tow request transmitted. Dispatch acknowledgement received. He then looked toward Ricky before returning his attention to the screen. "Thank you," he said politely. "Now, would you also show us the verification log that precedes the tow authorization?" Sullivan tapped through another menu. His confidence began fading as he searched for the requested entry. He found the section but hesitated briefly after noticing the order in which the events had been recorded. The visitor did not accuse him of making a mistake. Instead, he asked another calm question. "Is this the complete sequence generated automatically by the system?" Sullivan nodded. "Yes." The younger visitor made a short handwritten note. Ricky still said nothing. His silence somehow drew even more attention than if he had argued. Several people in the growing crowd leaned forward, curious about why such ordinary administrative details suddenly seemed so important. Even Sergio, the tow truck operator, quietly stepped back from the Tahoe and waited beside his truck without preparing the towing equipment. Halfway through the review, the older visitor spoke again. "Officer Sullivan, according to these timestamps, the request for contracted towing appears to have been submitted before the verification checklist was fully completed." Sullivan immediately answered, "The verification was completed. I simply finished entering part of it afterward." The visitor nodded respectfully. "That explanation may very well be correct. We simply document what the system records." Sullivan felt a knot forming in his stomach. Until that moment, he had viewed the conversation as little more than an inconvenience. Now he realized every action was being examined with unusual precision. The younger visitor quietly opened another folder containing copies of municipal transportation procedures adopted under the city's federal grant agreement. Without raising his voice, he pointed to one highlighted paragraph describing the required documentation sequence before non-emergency towing actions could proceed. Sullivan recognized the language immediately because he had reviewed the policy during annual training. He also knew that supervisors rarely discussed it during daily enforcement briefings. Ricky finally spoke for the first time in several minutes. "Officer, I want to be very clear. I am not suggesting today's documentation alone determines whether the tow was appropriate. Administrative reviews examine patterns, not isolated moments." Sullivan looked directly at him. "Patterns?" Ricky nodded. "One incident rarely tells the entire story." The older visitor closed the folder and added, "When procedural questions arise, standard practice requires us to compare similar cases over an established period. That protects both the public and the officers involved." Sullivan swallowed quietly. The meaning became obvious almost immediately. This conversation was no longer focused solely on the black Tahoe parked in the loading zone. The visitors were already thinking beyond this morning. The older visitor reached into his document case once more and removed a formal request form bearing an official government seal. After confirming the date and location, he handed a copy to Sullivan with professional courtesy. "Officer, we will need access to the complete towing authorization records generated by your district during the previous 6 months so we can conduct a routine comparative review." The words settled over the sidewalk in complete silence. Sullivan stared at the document while Sergio slowly lowered his clipboard. Around them, the curious bystanders stopped whispering altogether, and across the street, a marked police supervisor's vehicle turned onto Broad Street before pulling quietly toward the curb. The marked supervisor's vehicle came to a smooth stop behind the tow truck, and Lieutenant Tia Valencia stepped onto the sidewalk with the measured pace of someone responding to what she expected would be an ordinary enforcement question. She greeted Officer Ronald Sullivan with a brief nod before looking toward the two professionally dressed visitors. "Good morning," she said. "Dispatch advised me there was a request involving towing documentation." The older visitor introduced himself and his colleague, presenting official identification without unnecessary ceremony. Valencia examined the credentials carefully before returning them. Her expression remained professional, but the conversation immediately became more formal. "How may I assist you?" she asked. The visitor handed her a copy of the written records request. "We are requesting access to towing authorization records maintained by this district as part of a transportation compliance review." Valencia read the first page without interruption. When she reached the section describing the requested documents, she looked up. Was this review initiated because of today's incident? Ricky answered before anyone else could speculate. No, Lieutenant. This review was scheduled weeks ago. My assignment this morning involved collecting inspection materials inside the transportation center. The parking encounter simply became part of the documentation after it occurred. Valencia shifted her attention back to the visitors. So today's events were not the reason for the review. Correct, the older visitor replied. However, once an event occurs during an active review period, established procedures require us to preserve the associated records. Sullivan listened quietly. Until that moment, he had believed Ricky had somehow arranged for investigators to appear after the confrontation began. Realizing the review already existed before they met made the situation feel even more unsettling. Nothing had been staged. Nothing had been orchestrated. The morning had simply unfolded into an existing process. Valencia folded the request carefully. I understand. Our department will cooperate fully. Sullivan finally spoke. Lieutenant, this was a straightforward parking violation. Valencia answered calmly. Perhaps it was. That determination is separate from whether every administrative requirement was completed correctly. Her response carried no criticism, only a reminder that multiple questions could exist within the same incident. The older visitor thanked her and explained that the review focused on documentation practices connected to transportation programs supported through federal funding. If administrative procedures consistently matched established requirements, the review would simply confirm compliance. If recurring inconsistencies appeared, recommendations would follow. Ricky remained completely silent during the explanation. He neither encouraged nor discouraged any conclusion. Midway through the discussion, the younger visitor received a telephone call. He stepped a few feet away, listened carefully, then returned with a quiet update. The Regional Records Office has confirmed they are preparing the comparative reporting files requested for this review. Valencia acknowledged the information with a slight nod. Sullivan noticed the exchange immediately. The review was expanding beyond anything occurring on the sidewalk. It was no longer centered on one citation, one vehicle, or one officer. The visitors then asked Valencia one additional question. Lieutenant, approximately how many non-emergency towing authorizations has this district processed during the past 6 months? Valencia considered the question before answering honestly. I do not know the exact number without checking the system, but it is substantial. The older visitor thanked her. That will be sufficient for now. Sergio, the tow truck operator, remained waiting beside his truck with remarkable patience. Valencia finally turned toward him. Please hold the vehicle until the documentation questions are resolved. Sergio nodded immediately. Yes, Lieutenant. No one celebrated the pause. Ricky did not smile. Sullivan did not protest. The atmosphere had become unexpectedly quiet, as though everyone understood the discussion had moved beyond the immediate scene. Then Valencia's portable radio crackled to life. Dispatch informed her that archived towing records from district headquarters were already being located for immediate retrieval, and as she lowered the radio, she slowly looked back toward Officer Sullivan before asking one careful question. Ronald, have you personally reviewed every towing authorization you submitted during the past 6 months? Officer Ronald Sullivan did not answer Lieutenant Tia Valencia immediately. Instead, he looked down at the handheld device still resting in his hand, as though it might somehow contain a different answer than the one forming in his mind. No, he admitted after several quiet seconds. I review individual reports when they are completed, but I have never gone back through 6 months of them. Valencia nodded without judgment. Most officers have not. The older federal visitor closed his folder before speaking. That is precisely why comparative reviews exist. Individual incidents rarely reveal larger administrative patterns. Sullivan slowly looked toward Ricky. For the first time that morning, he studied the man without making assumptions based on his appearance. Ricky had never demanded special treatment. He had never threatened anyone, never raised his voice, and never suggested the parking rules should not apply to him. He had simply continued asking whether the required procedures had been followed. The realization unsettled Sullivan more than any accusation could have. Valencia asked Sergio, the tow truck operator, to remain available but to suspend any further action until the documentation questions were resolved. Sergio agreed immediately and returned to his truck, leaving the Tahoe exactly where it sat. Around them, the crowd had begun to thin as office workers continued toward their jobs, yet a handful of curious witnesses remained nearby. sensing the morning was still unfolding. A few minutes later, the younger federal visitor received another secure message on his government-issued phone. After reading it carefully, he quietly handed the screen to his colleague. Neither man reacted dramatically. They simply exchanged a brief glance before the older visitor addressed Valencia. The Regional Records Office has confirmed that the relevant files are being preserved and indexed. No comparative findings are available yet, and none should be expected until the records have been reviewed and comparable cases have been identified. Sullivan felt his shoulders tighten. "So you have not found a pattern?" he asked. The visitor answered carefully. "Not yet. At this stage, we have identified a procedural question in today's record and enough information to determine that a broader review is necessary. The evidence, not the urgency of this moment, will determine what the records show." Valencia accepted the explanation without interruption. She understood the difference between identifying a pattern and reaching a conclusion. Ricky remained silent. He made no attempt to influence the conversation because he knew the documents, not opinions, would determine what happened next. Sullivan quietly replayed the morning in his own mind. The courier who had mentioned the brief stop. Ricky's calm request to explain why he was there. The credential case Sullivan had initially refused to examine. None of those moments had seemed significant when they happened. Together, however, they painted a picture he had never stopped to consider. The older visitor continued. "Officer Sullivan, today's review is not centered on one parking citation. Administrative systems are designed to evaluate consistency over time. Sometimes they confirm that procedures were followed correctly. Sometimes they reveal opportunities for improvement." Sullivan nodded slowly. "And if they reveal something else? Then the facts will speak for themselves," the visitor replied. The answer carried neither accusation nor reassurance. It was simply the standard every review was expected to follow. Valencia then asked a practical question. "What happens next?" The younger visitor opened another folder containing the next phase of the review schedule. The comparative analysis will include towing authorizations, verification records, supervisory approvals, and demographic data where legally available. The objective is to determine whether documented practices remained consistent regardless of the driver involved. Sullivan heard one phrase more clearly than all the others. Regardless of the driver involved. He understood exactly what it meant without anyone saying another word. Ricky finally looked toward him and spoke for the first time in several minutes. "Officer, I sincerely hope the records support every decision you made. That outcome would benefit everyone." Sullivan searched Ricky's face for sarcasm, but found none. The statement appeared completely genuine. Before anyone could continue, Lieutenant Valencia's department-issued telephone began ringing. She answered, listened carefully, and her composed expression changed almost imperceptibly. When the call ended, she looked at the two federal visitors and said, "District Headquarters has located an internal performance memorandum that was circulated several months ago. Based on what I have just been told, I believe every person standing here will want to read it." Lieutenant Tia Valencia lowered her telephone slowly, taking a moment before speaking again. "The memorandum was never entered into the department's formal policy manual," she explained. "It was distributed as an internal management communication during a quarterly performance meeting." The older federal visitor asked a simple question. "Has a copy been secured?" Valencia nodded. "The records unit has already located it. They are forwarding both the original memorandum and the distribution history." Officer Ronald Sullivan remained silent. He vaguely remembered attending the meeting months earlier, but at the time the presentation had seemed routine. Supervisors often discussed productivity, response times, and efficient use of department resources. He had never questioned whether any of those conversations might later become significant. The younger visitor quietly opened his notebook. "Internal guidance can be important," he said, "particularly if it influences field decisions without becoming official policy." Valencia agreed. "That is exactly why. I want to review the actual language before drawing conclusions." Ricky Salazar listened without interrupting. Throughout the entire morning, he had resisted every opportunity to make the situation personal. He had never claimed that one officer represented an entire department, and he had never suggested that every enforcement action reflected unfair intent. Instead, he had consistently directed everyone's attention back to procedures, documentation, and accountability. That approach was beginning to reshape the conversation itself. A few remaining bystanders quietly dispersed as the morning traffic returned to its normal rhythm. Sergio, the tow truck operator, leaned against his truck while completing his own service notes. The Tahoe remained exactly where it had been parked, untouched since Valencia instructed that the towing process be paused. Several minutes later, the younger visitor received an encrypted electronic copy of the memorandum. He read it carefully before handing the screen to his colleague. Neither man reacted immediately. Instead, they both reread several sections before the older visitor finally looked toward Valencia. "Lieutenant, this document does not establish improper conduct by itself," he said. "However, some of its performance language could reasonably influence discretionary towing decisions if interpreted too aggressively." Valencia accepted the observation. "I understand." Sullivan quietly asked, "What does it say?" Valencia answered honestly, "I would rather read the complete document before summarizing it." The older visitor closed the electronic file and spoke with deliberate precision. One section encourages officers to maximize compliance through consistent enforcement activity. Standing alone, there is nothing unusual about that. Another section references improving operational efficiency by reducing delays before contracted towing authorization. Those statements are not necessarily improper, but they must always be interpreted alongside the formal procedures that remain controlling. Sullivan slowly nodded. He remembered supervisors emphasizing efficiency during busy traffic periods. He had viewed quicker decisions as better decisions. For the first time, he wondered whether speed had gradually replaced careful verification in some situations. Ricky finally spoke. "Policies shape behavior. Informal expectations shape behavior too. Sometimes the difference between them becomes difficult to recognize unless someone compares both." His words were calm rather than critical. Valencia appreciated that distinction. She turned toward the federal visitors. "Assuming your review identifies inconsistencies, what happens after that?" The older visitor answered without hesitation. "Our office prepares recommendations. Departments decide how to implement corrective measures. Our objective is long-term improvement, not public embarrassment." Sullivan looked directly at Ricky. "You have had opportunities all morning to make this about me." Ricky met his eyes. If one person becomes the entire story, the real problem often survives unchanged. The sentence lingered in the silence that followed. Even Valencia appeared thoughtful. She had supervised enough officers to know that organizational habits sometimes developed gradually, unnoticed until someone examined years of ordinary decisions together instead of one incident at a time. Just then another message arrived on the younger visitor's secure telephone. He read it once, then looked toward his colleague with visible surprise before quietly saying, "The comparative review team has reviewed the scope of the requested records, and there is one recommendation they want Ricky to consider before the formal analysis begins." The younger federal visitor lowered his telephone and looked toward Ricky Salazar before speaking. "The comparative review team has one recommendation they would like your office to consider before any personnel decisions move forward." Ricky listened without interrupting. "Go ahead." Based on the memorandum, today's documentation sequence, and the number of records requiring review, they believe the investigation should examine both individual decisions and the expectations created by district management. They recommend that systemic corrective measures be considered alongside any personnel findings once the formal analysis is complete. Lieutenant Tia Valencia quietly nodded. "That is consistent with what we have discussed this morning." Officer Ronald Sullivan remained still. Throughout the encounter, he had expected every new development to bring a harsher consequence directed at him personally. Instead, the conversation continued returning to policies, procedures, training, and organizational expectations. Ricky thanked the visitors before turning toward Valencia. "Lieutenant, my office will complete its review according to established procedures. However, I intend to recommend that any corrective plan include updated towing verification standards, annual documentation training, and independent audits of discretionary towing decisions. Those changes protect the public, but they also protect officers by making expectations unmistakably clear." Valencia appreciated the recommendation. "Those are practical improvements." Sullivan finally spoke, his voice quieter than it had been all morning. "Mr. Salazar, I owe you an apology." Ricky looked at him without saying anything. "I decided who you were before I knew anything about you," Sullivan continued. I gave that white delivery driver patience this morning, but I treated your explanation as an excuse before you finished speaking. I even refused to look at your credential when you first offered it. I cannot honestly separate that difference from the assumptions I made when I saw a black man step out of that SUV. Whether today's review had already been scheduled or not, I should have listened, followed the same process, and treated you by the same standard. Ricky accepted the apology with a slight nod. Thank you, officer. Listening does not always change the outcome, but it often changes the quality of the decision. No one applauded. No dramatic speeches followed. The older federal visitor simply closed his document case and confirmed that the remaining review would continue through normal administrative channels. Sergio, the tow truck operator, received official authorization from Lieutenant Valencia to cancel the tow request. He completed the cancellation paperwork, wished everyone a good day, and quietly drove away. Valencia then instructed Sullivan to finish the remaining administrative reports before returning to patrol. He acknowledged the instruction without argument. Before leaving, Ricky finally carried the inspection binder into the transportation center where his original meeting, delayed by nearly an hour, was still waiting to begin. Several months passed before the review reached its conclusion. The final report did not treat one confrontation outside one government building as proof of everything that had happened across the district. Instead, investigators compared similarly situated drivers, the reasons recorded for each tow, the time allowed before towing was requested, and whether required verification had been completed. The analysis found that black drivers were more likely than white drivers in comparable circumstances to face immediate discretionary towing rather than a warning or citation alone. Sullivan's records reflected the same disparity more often than the district average. The report did not claim that every unequal decision resulted from conscious racial hostility, but it concluded that documented racial disparities, inconsistent discretionary enforcement, and management pressure had combined to produce unequal enforcement outcomes. It recommended formal discipline, improved verification sequencing, supervisory review, bias training, and recurring independent audits. Sullivan received formal discipline and was removed from independent traffic enforcement duties while completing remedial procedural and anti-bias training. Any return to street enforcement would require supervisory approval, documented performance reviews, and periodic audits of his discretionary decisions. He was permitted to provide feedback about how the revised system functioned in practice, but he was not placed in charge of designing the policy intended to correct his own conduct. One autumn morning, nearly 6 months after their first meeting, Ricky returned to the same transportation center for another routine inspection. As he legally parked his Tahoe and stepped onto the sidewalk, a young patrol officer standing nearby smiled politely and said, "Good morning, sir." "Welcome back." Ricky smiled in return. "Good morning, officer." The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but it felt remarkably different from the first encounter. Nothing about the city had become perfect. Rules still existed. Citations were still issued. Tow trucks still answered legitimate requests. Yet something subtle had changed. Conversations now seemed to begin with questions instead of assumptions, and procedures were followed with greater care because everyone understood that fairness depended not only on good intentions, but also on consistent actions. Perhaps that is how meaningful change usually begins. Not through one dramatic victory or one unforgettable speech, but through ordinary people choosing to slow down long enough to see one another more clearly. This story quietly reminds us that first impressions can feel convincing even when they are incomplete, and that careful listening sometimes reveals details we never expected to matter. There are moments when the greatest strength is not proving that someone else was wrong, but creating space for better decisions the next time a similar situation appears. Small improvements inside everyday routines may never become headlines, yet they often shape the trust that communities build over many years. Thank you for spending this journey with these characters. I would genuinely enjoy hearing your thoughts. If you had been standing on that sidewalk, which moment would have changed your perspective the most? And how do you think you would have handled the situation differently?